Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to an era that, on the surface, seems like something straight out of a fairy tale. We're going to wander the winding, cobblestone streets of Tudor Britain, a land of grand castles, bejeweled monarchs, and dramatic, cloak and dagger politics. But forget the sanitized, romanticized images from your high school history books. Tonight, we're getting our hands dirty and our senses overwhelmed. Imagine you're standing on a bustling London thoroughfare. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, rotting refuse, and something else, a sharp, acrid scent that makes your eyes water. The streets are a chaotic mess of merchants, animals, and beggars. A cart laden with night soil, human waste, trudges past, spilling its noxious contents into the open gutter. You pull your collar up over your nose, but it does little good. A reality check for all of us. You probably wouldn't survive a single week here, let alone a day. The smallest cut, the wrong drink, even a simple cold could be your undoing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Maybe someone else is listening from the exact same street corner in a different time zone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on East Cheap, a main artery of London. The noise is incredible, the clanging of a blacksmith, the cries of street vendors, the distant peal of church bells. You're not quite sure where to look first. A man in a stained tunic hawks eels from a bucket. A noblewoman, her face caked in white lead makeup, is carried past on a sedan chair, a servant fanning her to keep the flies away. Just a few feet from you, two men are arguing over the price of a chicken, and their shouts fill the air. The smells are the most immediate assault on your senses. Remember how a hot day in a city can sometimes have a certain aroma? Now multiply that by 100. Add in the stench of open sewers, unwashed bodies, and the lingering odour from a nearby tannery, and you're getting close. This is the Tudor version of a city symphony, and it's a constant, overpowering assault. A mainstream historical fact, the population of London swelled dramatically during the Tudor period, reaching around 200,000 by the end of Elizabeth I's reign. This massive growth put an incredible strain on the city's resources, especially its primitive sanitation systems. The city was a breeding ground for disease, a truth you're feeling in your very bones as you stand here, trying not to touch anything. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that wealthy Tudors would sometimes carry pomanders? Small balls filled with fragrant herbs and spices, to ward off the foul smells and the bad air they believed caused disease? You'd probably want one of those right now. Historians still argue whether the high population density was a primary driver of the frequent plague outbreaks or if other factors, like trade routes and hygiene practices, played a more significant role. Either way, you feel the press of the crowd, the closeness of strangers, and a little flicker of unease in your stomach. It's hard to imagine anyone could feel truly safe in this chaotic, overstuffed world. You take a deep breath, or at least you try to, and the smells of the street fill your lungs. You're ready to move on, to see what else this strange and unsettling time has to offer. But first, you have to get your bearings in this new reality, where survival is not a given. You continue your walk, or more accurately, your trudge, down the muddy, refuse-strewn street. The air, already thick with the general miasma of humanity, seems to be growing even heavier. You glance down the road and see what looks like a large, open channel running down the centre, filled with a sluggish, dark liquid. A man holding a bucket empties it directly into this channel, and the contents splash up, narrowly missing your worn-out shoes. This is the River Fleet, or rather, what's left of it. It's no longer the pristine tributary you might have read about, it's London's great open sewer, a testament to the city's complete and utter failure at sanitation. This, you realise with a sinking feeling, is where a lot of London's waste ends up. Historians still argue whether the smell from the River Fleet was worse during summer heat waves or after a heavy rain, but you're experiencing a little bit of both. And it's a truly formidable bouquet. The smell is so pervasive it seems to have a physical presence. It clings to your clothes, seeps into your hair, and just hangs there. You feel a sudden sympathy for anyone who had to live here, to have this as their constant background aroma. You wonder if they even noticed it after a while, if it just became the normal scent of life. A mainstream historical fact you've been told is that the sanitation system in Tudor London was almost non-existent. There were no public sewers in the modern sense. Waste was simply thrown into open ditches, cesspits, or directly into the Thames and its tributaries. Imagine every toilet bowl in a modern city just emptying out onto the street. That's essentially what you're dealing with. It's the kind of thing that makes you appreciate indoor plumbing more than you ever thought you would. The Great Stink, as it would later be known, was less of an event and more of a constant state of being. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some wealthier citizens would have garderobes in their homes, essentially a latrine that emptied directly into a moat or a cesspit below. But this was a luxury, and for the vast majority, it was a simple matter of a chamber pot and a prayer. Remember that line in movies where someone yells "Gardiloo" before tossing the contents of a pot out a window? That was a real and necessary warning. The sheer audacity of it, just flinging your personal waste out onto a public thoroughfare. It's a reminder of a time when the personal and public spheres were far, far more intertwined, and not in a good way. It's a miracle anyone wasn't constantly sick. The lack of sanitation wasn't just unpleasant, it was a lethal public health crisis. You can feel the disease in the air, a kind of low-level hum of sickness that never quite goes away. The streets are a breeding ground for rats, flies, and all the other vectors of disease. It's a classic example of a system that simply couldn't keep up with its own growth. The city was expanding, but its infrastructure was stuck in the Dark Ages. You feel a bead of sweat trickle down your back, and you instinctively flinch. A simple scratch, a small splinter, could easily become infected in this environment. You're walking on ground that is, in a very real sense, a ticking time bomb of microbial dangers. It's a bit like a video game where every step you take has a small chance of inflicting a status effect. And that status effect is dysentery or plague. And unlike a game, there's no quick save function. You turn a corner, and the smell of the river fleet fades slightly, replaced by a new, equally pungent scent. You find yourself in front of a butcher's stall. The air is thick with the smell of blood and raw meat, attracting a swarm of buzzing flies. The butcher, a stout man with an apron stained with gore, laughs heartily at a joke from a customer. You shudder, thinking about how quickly that meat would spoil in the summer heat, with no refrigeration to keep it fresh. Just another thing to worry about in a world full of them. With the stench of the butcher's stall fading behind you, you find yourself thinking about personal hygiene. You feel a sudden, overwhelming urge to find a nice, hot shower with unlimited water and a bar of soap that actually lathers. You feel a phantom itch on your scalp and an uncomfortable stickiness on your skin. This, you realize, is the standard state of being for a Tudor. For the common folk, it was a trip to the local bathhouse or a quick dip in a river, neither of which sounds particularly appealing given what you now know about the state of their waterways. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that many Tudors would wash their clothes much more frequently than they would wash themselves? Clean linens were a status symbol, and they believed that clean clothes were a better defense against disease than a clean body. This is a bit like believing your car will run better if you just wash the outside and never change the oil. It makes you realize their priorities were wildly different from our own. You can almost see the logic. Though, in a world where the air itself felt like it was trying to make you sick, why bother with your body when your clothes could do the heavy lifting? You can almost feel the discomfort of it all. The starched ruffs, the multiple layers of woolen cloth, the restrictive corsets, all of it worn over skin that hadn't seen a proper scrubbing in weeks, maybe months. Historians still argue whether the lack of bathing was purely a fear of disease or if it was simply a matter of practicality, given the immense effort required to heat enough water. Either way, the result was the same. You realize that a lot of those sweet-smelling perfumes and herbs you heard about weren't for pleasure, they were for masking the pervasive body odor. It's a very practical solution to a very pungent problem. You also notice something else. People's faces are surprisingly pale, and many have a variety of skin ailments, from rashes to sores. Without proper hygiene and sanitation, even minor skin conditions could fester and become serious. The simple act of washing your hands with soap and water, a habit we take for granted, was a luxury or a superstition they hadn't yet fully embraced. The idea of cleanliness is next to godliness wasn't quite a thing yet. Instead, it was more like cleanliness is next to an open invitation for plague. The logic is flawed. but the fear was very, very real. You imagine trying to explain to a Tudor that you would willingly stand under a torrent of hot water for a good 15 minutes every single day, just because you felt like it. They would look at you with a mix of pity and disbelief. A daily shower, what a preposterous waste of time and resources. For them, life was a constant struggle for survival, and a single day was filled with enough chores and dangers that the idea of a leisurely bath was truly beyond the pale. Leaving the topic of personal hygiene and its aromatic implications behind, you find yourself at the edge of a small village, stepping out of London's urban sprawl and into the harsh reality of the English countryside. The air is still not exactly fresh. It's full of the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and a different kind of animal refuse, but it's a welcome change. This is where most of the Tudor population lived and died. Your chances of surviving here are statistically higher than in the disease-ridden city. But your life would be a relentless, back-breaking cycle of labour with few comforts and no guaranteed rewards. This is the life of a peasant. You watch as a man with a bent back and calloused hands guides a simple wooden plough behind a lumbering ox. His field is a small, ragged plot, and every turn of the soil looks like a monumental effort. This is his entire world. A mainstream historical fact, the vast majority of people in Tudor England were rural peasants, or husbandmen, who worked the land. Their lives were dictated by the seasons, the sun, and the whims of their lord. They were tied to the land, living in tiny, wattle and daub cottages with thatched roofs, often sharing their living space with their livestock for warmth. The idea of going to the office was simply nonsensical. Their office was the field, and their work was never, ever done. A quirky or fringe tidbit. In some regions, peasants would practice gleaning, which allowed them to go into the fields after the harvest was completed and collect any leftover grains. It was a centuries-old tradition, but it was at the mercy of the lord of the manor. This was often the only way a family could secure enough food to survive the long, lean winter months. It's a small but powerful example of the fine line between survival and starvation. You can see the desperation in the gleaners' movements, hunched over and searching for a single forgotten stalk of wheat. Historians still argue whether the life of a Tudor peasant was one of simple contentment and strong community bonds, or one of constant drudgery and oppression. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. You can see the community aspect as you watch neighbours helping each other with a harvest or gathering for a church service, but you can also see the sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion on their faces. There was no such thing as a day off or a vacation. Their time was not their own, their bodies were tools for labour, and their lives were a long, continuous effort to secure the most basic of needs: food, shelter, and a bit of warmth. You look down at your own hands, soft and unused to physical labour. In this world, they are a liability. Your lack of calluses would mark you immediately as an outsider, someone who did not belong to the rhythm of this life. You watch a woman carrying 2 heavy wooden buckets of water from the village well, and you realise how every single task was a physical challenge. There were no pumps, no running water, no easy solutions. Everything, from a simple meal to a clean shirt, had to be earned through sweat and strain. There was a raw, unfiltered physicality to existence that we simply can't comprehend in our modern, convenience-filled lives. You might be thinking, well, at least they got to enjoy the fresh country air. But as you take a deeper breath, you realise it's not all clean breezes and birdsong. The air is thick with the smell of manure, the smoke from peat fires, and the general odour of an agrarian society. It's a natural smell, but it's a heavy one. You can almost feel the aches in your own back just from watching the endless toil. You have a sudden, profound appreciation for the simple act of turning on a tap and getting clean water. As you stand on the edge of the village, watching the peasants toil, a new thought creeps into your mind. All this talk of hygiene and labour has made you thirsty. You glance toward the village well, but then you remember the muddy, polluted River Fleet you saw in London. You also remember that most of the local livestock share a water source with the villagers. You suddenly feel very, very grateful for bottled water in Tudor Britain. The simple act of quenching your thirst was fraught with peril. The water you see in a nearby stream or even from a supposedly clean well is a ticking time bomb of unseen dangers. You watch as a young boy dips a bucket into the village well. You can't see what's in the water, but you know what's been on the ground around it. The risk of contamination was incredibly high. A mainstream historical fact, most people in Tudor England did not drink water, at least not on its own. They relied on weaker, fermented drinks like ale and cider, which were much safer to consume. The fermentation process killed many of the harmful bacteria that thrived in contaminated water sources. This wasn't a preference for alcohol, it was a matter of survival. Even children drank small beer, a low-alcohol brew, because it was safer than the water. It's a very strange thought. A world where the safest beverage for a 5-year-old is a form of alcohol. A quirky or fringe tidbit, because of this reliance on ale. Breweries were everywhere. Many households, even those of modest means, would brew their own beer. It was a common domestic chore, usually done by the women of the house. The brewer's spoon was a respected tool, and being a good brewer was a highly valued skill. The quality of a household's ale was a point of pride, and it was a form of hospitality to offer a traveller a drink from your own brew. You realise that a pub wasn't just a place to get a drink, it was a public health station, a place where you could be relatively sure your beverage wouldn't give you dysentery. Historians still argue whether the high consumption of ale led to a state of constant low-level inebriation, or if the alcohol content was so low that it was simply a form of hydration. You can almost imagine it either way, a perpetually tipsy society, or one that simply used alcohol as a safe stand-in for water. You probably wouldn't have a choice in the matter, though, if you wanted to live, you'd be drinking some form of fermented grain or apple juice with every meal. The very idea of an ice-cold glass of tap water would be utterly foreign and probably terrifying to a Tudor. You watch the boy carry the bucket away, and you feel a profound sense of unease. What happens if he drops it? What if he slips? You feel a newfound appreciation for the modern infrastructure that brings clean, safe water directly to your home. It's a luxury that we take completely for granted, and it's something that the Tudors could only have dreamed of. You have to wonder what they would think of our modern habit of drinking water straight from a fountain or a bottle. They would probably be convinced we were all tempting fate, playing a very dangerous game of Russian roulette with our digestive systems. You take a deep, slow breath and try to banish the thought of contaminated water. The reality of this time is that every aspect of life, even something as simple as a drink, was a potential risk. There were no health regulations, no water treatment plants, and very little understanding of germs. It's a world where ignorance wasn't bliss, it was a ticking clock. With every passing moment in this historical reenactment, you feel more and more vulnerable. The air is a cocktail of unknown microbes. The water is a potential death sentence. And now you have a new and very real fear, the diseases themselves. You walk past a hovel and hear a terrible cough from within, a deep, rattling sound that makes you instinctively pull your scarf over your face. This wasn't just a simple cold. In this era, every illness was a life-or-death gamble, a mainstream historical fact. Tudor England was a hotbed of deadly diseases. The lack of sanitation, poor nutrition, and crowded living conditions were the perfect breeding ground for epidemics. You're not just worried about the plague anymore. There was also the sweating sickness, a mysterious and terrifying illness that could kill a person within 24 hours. The symptoms were a sudden fever, violent sweating, and an unbearable thirst. No one knew what caused it, and there was no cure. You just had to hope you didn't get it. It was so fast and so lethal that people would literally be fine one moment and dead the next. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that people often carried posies, small bouquets of flowers, not just for the smell, but because they believed the fragrant herbs would ward off disease. This is where the old nursery rhyme, "Ring around the rosy," is thought to come from, with a pocket full of posies being a desperate attempt to fend off the plague. It's a sad and slightly sweet image, people clinging to their flowers as they face down an invisible enemy they couldn't possibly understand. Historians still argue whether the sweating sickness was a new disease or a more virulent strain of an existing one, possibly a form of influenza. The historical records are vague, but the terror was very real. You can feel the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in the air, the kind of fear that makes you jump every time you hear a cough or see someone looking a little pale. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, and every ache and pain was a cause for genuine alarm. You can almost feel the vulnerability. A cut from a rusty tool in a field could lead to tetanus. A simple fever could be the start of a fatal journey. A toothache could become an abscess that kills you. We live in a world where a trip to the doctor for a sore throat is a minor inconvenience, but in Tudor England, it could be the end of your story. You suddenly understand why they were so superstitious. When you have no real way of fighting back against the things that are trying to kill you, you turn to spells, prayers, and good luck charms. You do anything to feel like you have a little bit of control. As you continue your walk, you see a group of people gathered in the village square, all looking somber. You see a man being carried on a stretcher, his face covered in dark spots. You don't need a modern doctor to tell you what that is. It's a quiet, chilling reminder that you're in a world where death is a constant companion, not a distant stranger. You pull your collar a little higher and quicken your pace, hoping to outrun the invisible threat that hangs in the very air around you. You've seen the symptoms of disease in others, and now you can't help but wonder about the state of public health on a larger scale. You wander into a marketplace and see a public pillory, where a man is being punished for selling bad meat. You also see a sign with a proclamation from the local mayor about keeping the streets clean, a proclamation that seems to be widely ignored, given the state of the ground you're walking on. This, you realize, is the extent of their public health system. It's a patchwork of superstition, punitive measures, and a fundamental lack of understanding. A mainstream historical fact, there was no real concept of public health in the Tudor period as we know it today. The government's response to disease was often reactive and based on a mix of religious fervour and simple, brute force measures. When the plague hit, for example, the local authorities would try to enforce quarantines, often by locking infected families in their homes. You can imagine the terror of that, to be walled up in your own house, left to the mercy of a disease that could kill you in a day. It was a desperate and often cruel measure, but in the absence of any real medical knowledge, it was all they had, a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some towns, special plague doctors were appointed. They weren't trained physicians, they were often men with no medical background, hired specifically to count the dead and bury the bodies. They wore a long coat and a beaked mask, which they filled with sweet-smelling herbs, believing this would protect them from the bad air that carried the disease. This is a perfect example of their medical approach, a mix of good intentions, symbolic gestures, and a lot of superstition. The sight of a plague doctor must have been a truly terrifying thing, a grim harbinger of death and sickness. Historians still argue whether these quarantine measures helped at all or simply hastened the spread of the disease by creating enclosed, contaminated spaces. You can see both sides of the debate. On the one hand, it might have kept some people from spreading the sickness. On the other, it was essentially a death sentence for those who were locked up. You find yourself thinking about modern public health campaigns and the little reminders we get to wash our hands or get a flu shot. In Tudor times, a public health campaign was a group of people ringing a bell and shouting, "Bring out your dead," as they went from house to house. You also see the brutal side of this lack of knowledge. If someone was sick with a contagious disease, they were often shunned and forced to fend for themselves. There was no social safety net. You're left with the grim thought that a good character and a decent family could be your only defense against a fatal illness. In this world, a person's sickness wasn't just a physical ailment, it was a social and economic disaster. It's a very harsh and unforgiving reality. The sheer ignorance of germ theory is the most chilling part of it all. They had no idea that a fly buzzing over a piece of uncovered meat was carrying germs that could make you sick. They had no idea that the filth on the streets was a cause of their suffering. All of their public health efforts were based on faulty premises, and you're walking right in the middle of all of it, with the public health system, or lack thereof, in mind. You find yourself thinking about the individual doctors and healers of the time. You pass by a small, wooden sign advertising the services of a barber surgeon. This, you realize with a little shiver, is the closest thing to a doctor most people in Tudor England would ever see. This is the era of bizarre medical practices, strange remedies, and a healthy dose of pure guesswork. The man's window displays a few tools that look more suited to a carpenter than a physician. A mainstream historical fact, medicine in Tudor Britain was a chaotic mix of ancient Greek ideas, herbal remedies, and sheer superstition. There were no regulated medical schools or licensing boards as we know them. A barber surgeon was a hybrid professional who could cut your hair, pull a tooth, and even amputate a limb. Their training was an apprenticeship, not a formal education. The famous red and white striped pole outside their shop symbolized the two key aspects of their trade, the red for blood from surgery and the white for the bandages used to dress wounds. You can almost hear the buzz of a fly near the window, and you shudder at the thought of a major surgery being performed in such unsanitary conditions. A quirky or fringe tidbit, A common medical cure for everything from the plague to a simple fever was a concoction called theriac. It was a complex, multi-ingredient remedy that sometimes contained dozens of different herbs and spices, and on occasion, even parts of exotic animals like crocodile dung. It was believed to be a miracle cure for many ailments, but its effectiveness was, to put it mildly, questionable. It was a perfect example of the shotgun approach to medicine. Throw everything you can at the problem and hope something sticks. You can imagine a patient being presented with a spoonful of this dark, foul-smelling goop, told it would save them. It's a very different world from our neatly packaged pills and precision-engineered treatments. Historians still argue whether some of the herbal remedies they used had any real medicinal value, or if their healing properties were purely psychosomatic. The truth is probably a mix of both. Some herbs, like willow bark, do contain a natural form of aspirin, but a lot of their cures were based on the doctrine of signatures, the belief that a plant's appearance indicated what it could cure. For example, a yellow plant was thought to cure jaundice. It was a beautiful, but deeply flawed, system of natural medicine. You can almost feel the vulnerability of being a patient in this era. Imagine you have a toothache. Your dentist is a man who also cuts hair. He might simply pull the tooth out with a crude set of pliers, and the pain would be immense. Your only solace would be a prayer and a strong ale. You realize that a simple ear infection, something we barely think twice about, could be a fatal condition. The lack of knowledge and the reliance on dangerous, unproven remedies made every illness a roll of the dice. You see a small boy with a bandaged hand, and you can't help but wonder how that wound was dressed and what strange concoction was applied to it. You hope for his sake it was just a clean cloth. The next time you get a headache, you'll have a newfound appreciation for the modern pharmacy. For the Tudor, the best medicine was often a mix of luck, superstition, and a desperate hope that their body would just heal itself. With your stomach rumbling and a growing sense of vulnerability, you turn your thoughts to food. You've seen the farms and the meagre plots of land. Now you're in a bustling market, surrounded by the raw ingredients of a Tudor meal. Your modern eyes see a lot of things that don't look particularly appetizing. Hunks of meat hanging without any refrigeration, bread that looks hard as a rock, and vegetables that are covered in a fine layer of dirt. This is the Tudor diet, and it was a world away from our neatly packaged groceries and guaranteed food safety. A mainstream historical fact, the Tudor diet was a stark reflection of one's social class. If you were a peasant, your diet was simple and monotonous, centered on things you could grow yourself. You would eat bread, often made from rye or barley, and a thick stew called pottage, which was a mix of vegetables, beans, and whatever else was available. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions. Your diet was high in carbohydrates and fiber, but often lacked essential vitamins and protein, leading to all kinds of health problems. If you were wealthy, however, your diet was the polar opposite. You would have access to a huge variety of meats, beef, lamb, pork, and even more exotic things like swan or peacock. Your bread would be made from fine wheat flour, and you would eat a lot of sugar, something the lower classes couldn't afford. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that the Tudors had a very strange food hierarchy? The swan, for example, was an incredibly popular and expensive dish. It was a sign of extreme wealth and status. And for some reason, they were also really into lamprey eels, a parasitic fish with a sucking, jawless mouth. King Henry I is rumoured to have died from eating a surfeit of lampreys. It makes you wonder how a culture decides that something like a swan is a delicacy, but a perfectly good chicken is just for the commoners. Historians still argue whether the constant threat of starvation among the lower classes was a greater hardship than the health problems caused by the overindulgence of the wealthy. The wealthy had gout, tooth decay, and obesity, while the poor had vitamin deficiencies and chronic hunger. You can see the consequences of this dietary divide in the very people you pass. The wealthy nobles look soft and pale, while the peasants are lean and weathered. You have a choice between an uncomfortable and possibly deadly feast and a life of constant hunger. It's a lose-lose situation. You watch a baker pull a fresh loaf of bread from a brick oven. The smell is wonderful, but you know that the bread will be stale and hard by tomorrow. There's no plastic wrap or airtight containers. Every aspect of food was a direct battle against spoilage and waste. The idea of leftovers was something you ate immediately or gave to the dogs. You feel a pang of homesickness for the simple convenience of a refrigerator. You see a child holding a single apple, eating it slowly and deliberately. You realize that a piece of fruit like that was probably a rare and welcome treat. Something to be savored. It's a powerful reminder of a time when food was not just sustenance, it was a constant preoccupation, a sign of your place in the world, and a measure of your luck. After considering the grim realities of the Tudor diet, you notice something else in the market. The wealthy are walking by, their faces powdered, their expensive clothes rustling, and every single one of them, from the lord to the lady, has a smile that is, well, not a smile at all, but rather a grimace. You get a closer look at a noblewoman who is trying to speak to her servant, and you realize why. Her teeth are black, some are missing, and others are stained a deep, alarming brown. The high-sugar diet of the wealthy had a very visible and very painful consequence. A mainstream historical fact. Tooth decay was a widespread and incredibly painful problem in Tudor England, especially among the upper classes, when sugar became more widely available thanks to new trade routes. It was a luxury only the rich could afford. They would add it to everything, their meat, their wine, their desserts. They saw it as a sign of wealth. The result was rampant dental caries, painful abscesses, and widespread tooth loss. Queen Elizabeth I herself was famous for having black, decaying teeth, and she even had them powdered to try and cover up the damage. It was a sign of her immense wealth, but it was also a source of constant pain. A quirky or fringe tidbit. People often tried to cure toothaches with bizarre remedies, including tying a live frog to their cheek or applying a poultice made from mouse brains and herbs. These cures were, of course, completely ineffective, and you can only imagine the sheer desperation that would lead someone to try such a thing. It's a sad reminder that when a remedy sounds completely ridiculous, it's often a sign of a society that is grasping at straws in the face of immense suffering. Historians still argue whether the black teeth of the wealthy were considered a symbol of beauty, or if they were simply a sad reality that people had to live with. Some sources suggest that black teeth became a sort of macabre status symbol, a visible sign that you could afford a luxury that was slowly eating away at your mouth. You see a young noblewoman with a perfectly white smile, but you can see her trying to hide it, as if it is a sign of her family's poverty. This is a world where health and wealth were not necessarily connected, and in fact, being rich often led to a whole new set of physical ailments. You feel a twinge in one of your own molars, and you instinctively wince. The pain of a modern toothache is bad enough, but imagine that pain without any kind of painkiller, and your only option is a visit to the aforementioned barber surgeon with his crude pliers. The thought alone is enough to make you feel a deep gratitude for modern dentistry. You watch a nobleman try to eat a piece of tough meat, and he has to chew it on one side of his mouth, wincing as he does. The irony is not lost on you. The very food that shows off his wealth is also a source of his constant, nagging pain. With the sight of rotting teeth still fresh in your mind, you wander back toward the village square. You see a baker selling loaves of bread from a stall, but they're not all the same. Some are pale and soft, while others are dark and coarse. This, you realize, is the final insult of the class system. Even in something as basic as a meal, the price of bread and beer wasn't just about economics, it was a political statement, a symbol of your place in the rigid social order. A mainstream historical fact, bread was not just a food staple, it was a powerful social marker. The wealthy ate manchet bread, a fine, white loaf made from pure wheat flour. It was soft, expensive, and a visible sign of their high status. The common folk ate maslin or rye bread, which was dark, dense, and often contained a mix of other grains like barley or oats. It was a sign of their low status and was often literally stale before it was even bought. The price of these two types of bread was wildly different, and the quality was even more so. This wasn't a matter of taste, it was a matter of access. A quirky or fringe tidbit, because of the high cost of white flour, bakers would sometimes add fillers to their bread to make it go further. These fillers could be anything from chalk to sawdust. There were laws against this, but they were difficult to enforce. You can almost imagine a baker winking at a customer and saying, "Don't worry, this loaf is extra woody today." It's a very strange thought. A world where the very thing that was supposed to sustain you was secretly trying to kill you, Historians still argue whether the high price of food was a deliberate tool of social control or if it was simply a consequence of a fragile agrarian economy. You can see both sides. When the harvest was bad, everyone suffered, but the poor suffered far more. And when the price of bread rose, riots would often follow. In a world with no social safety net, a single crop failure could lead to widespread starvation and civil unrest. The phrase bread and circuses was a Roman one, but its sentiment applied just as well here. The government knew that keeping the commoners fed was a crucial part of keeping them quiet. You watch a farmer haggle with a baker over the price of a loaf of rye bread. The baker won't budge, and the farmer finally hands over a small coin. His shoulders slumped in defeat. You realize that this is a transaction that is happening all over the country. Every single day, it's a constant battle for survival, and the price of a single loaf of bread is a weight that is felt deeply. You feel a pang of homesickness for the simple convenience of a grocery store with its endless, climate-controlled aisles. The price of bread and the state of your teeth have given you a powerful, visceral understanding of the Tudor class system. You've seen the stark differences in diet and hygiene, but as you move through the village, you begin to see it everywhere. The clothes people wear, the houses they live in, and the very way they carry themselves, all of it is a powerful signal of their place in the social hierarchy. There was very little social mobility, and your birthright dictated nearly every aspect of your life, from the cradle to the grave. A mainstream historical fact, Tudor society was structured like a pyramid. At the very top, you had the monarch, who was seen as God's representative on earth. Below them were the nobility, a small group of dukes, earls, and barons who owned vast amounts of land and held immense power. Then came the gentry, knights and squires who were wealthy landowners but did not hold noble titles. Below them were the yeomen, a class of freeholding farmers who owned their own land, and at the bottom, the overwhelming majority of the population were the labourers and peasants, who owned nothing and worked the land for others. This was not a system you could easily climb, a quirky or fringe tidbit. There were very strict sumptuary laws in place that dictated what a person could wear based on their social class. Only the monarch and the highest-ranking nobles could wear expensive furs like ermine or cloth of gold. Peasants were forbidden from wearing certain colours or fabrics. You could be fined or even arrested for wearing clothes that were above your station. It's a bit like a dress code for an entire country, and a very harsh one at that. You can imagine a peasant boy dreaming of a bright red tunic, only to be told he wasn't allowed to wear it. Historians still argue whether these sumptuary laws were truly effective at enforcing social boundaries or if they were a noble's attempt to preserve their sense of exclusivity. You can see how they would serve as a constant, visible reminder of your place in the world. You'd know instantly, just by looking at someone's clothes, where they stood in the social pecking order. You feel a pang of homesickness for the simple chaos of a modern clothing store, where anyone can buy a designer shirt if they have the money. In Tudor England, your clothes were a birth certificate and a prison all at once. You watch as a group of peasants respectfully doff their caps as a nobleman rides past on a beautiful horse. He doesn't even seem to notice them. This is the normal, everyday interaction between the classes. The nobleman has the power of life and death over his tenants, and everyone knows it. This isn't just a matter of economics, it's a matter of power and control. You can almost feel the weight of this invisible hierarchy, a kind of social gravity that holds everyone in their place. You realize that a simple conversation with a person of a different class could be a very awkward and dangerous undertaking. Having seen the peasant's lot and the visible signs of the class system, you now turn your attention to the pinnacle of that system, the royal court. You find yourself standing outside the gates of a magnificent palace, perhaps Hampton Court or Whitehall. The air here is different, it's still full of smells, but they're the smells of roasted meat, expensive perfumes, and the sharp scent of polished wood. This is a world of incredible wealth and power, but you sense, in the silent, watchful guards and the hushed whispers of the courtiers, that it is also a world of immense danger. This is a game of political maneuvering and intrigue, where a single misstep could cost you everything. A mainstream historical fact, the Tudor court was the centre of power in England, and it was a notoriously treacherous place. Courtiers lived in a constant state of anxiety, trying to gain the king's favour while simultaneously fending off their rivals. A nobleman's position wasn't guaranteed by his birth. It was a constant performance of loyalty and skill. The king was the son, and all the courtiers were planets, revolving around him, trying to get as close as possible without being burned. The stakes were incredibly high. One day you could be a trusted advisor, the next you could be in the Tower of London. A quirky or fringe tidbit, court jesters, or fools, were often the only people who could speak the truth to the king without fear of beheading. They were given a special kind of immunity, and their witty, often sarcastic, observations were a way for the monarch to receive honest feedback in a world of sycophants. It's a bit like a boss having a private stand-up comedian to keep them grounded. You can imagine a nervous jester, trying to decide how close to the line he could dance with his jokes. Historians still argue whether the constant political intrigue was a result of the Tudor personalities or if it was a natural consequence of a system with such concentrated power. You see both sides. When a king like Henry VIII could change his mind on a whim, everyone was at risk. You see a nervous-looking man in an expensive doublet, his eyes darting around the room, clearly trying to read the mood of the court. He's not a soldier or a labourer. His weapon is his wit and his political cunning. And you can see the mental strain it's putting on him. You realise that your modern ideas of networking and office politics are child's play compared to this. Here, a promotion or a demotion isn't a change in salary. It's a matter of life and death. The king's smile or frown could mean a noble family's fortune or their complete ruin. You feel a chill as you look at the stone walls of the palace, knowing that behind those walls, fortunes were made and lost, and heads were literally rolling. The treacherous world of the Tudor court brings you to the centerpiece of all that intrigue and power, the king himself. Henry VIII. You know his name from the history books, but now you see the consequences of his personality and his reign in the very faces of the people around you. You've heard the stories of his 6 wives, but now you understand that those marriages weren't just a matter of love or lust, they were a brutal game of political chess, with human lives as the pawns. A mainstream historical fact, Henry VIII's desire for a male heir was the driving force behind his 6 marriages and the English Reformation, when his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to give him a living son. He sought an annulment. When the Pope refused, Henry broke with the Catholic Church, declared himself the head of the new Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn. This act changed the course of English history forever, and it was all because a king wanted a son. You can see the consequences of this decision everywhere, from the new religious texts to the nervous glances of the church officials. A quirky or fringe tidbit, did you know that Anne of Cleves, Henry's 4th wife, was chosen based on a portrait by the court painter Hans Holbein? When she arrived in England, Henry was supposedly disgusted by her appearance and immediately sought an annulment. He famously called her his Flanders mare. It's a rather cruel and funny example of a time when a king's whim could be a matter of international diplomacy and a woman's entire future. You can almost feel the artist's fear, knowing that the king's opinion of his work could mean his own head. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church was an act of genuine religious conviction or a cynical move to consolidate his own power and get what he wanted. You can see both sides. There were certainly people who wanted to reform the church, but the timing of Henry's actions, right after the Pope's refusal, makes you wonder about his true motivations. Regardless of the reason, the consequences were immense. You see the courtier talking about the dissolution of the monasteries, a move that made the king and his allies incredibly wealthy, but left thousands of monks and nuns homeless. You can almost feel the tension in the air as you stand at court. The courtiers are watching every move, every gesture, trying to decipher the king's mood. You watch as a man hands a letter to a royal attendant, his hands trembling slightly. You know that a single word in that letter could either earn him a title or a trip to the executioner's block. It's a world where a person's life could be forfeit not for a crime, but for falling out of favour. You have to wonder what it would be like to live with that constant, low-grade fear, knowing that the most powerful person in the country could destroy you on a whim. The name of the Tower of London has been whispered in hushed tones for centuries, and for good reason, from the opulent, but tense, world of the royal court. You now find yourself standing at its grim, foreboding gates. You've heard the stories of this place, but as you approach, you feel the weight of its history. This isn't just a castle, it's a prison, a palace, and an execution site all rolled into one, and it's a testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of the Tudor regime. A mainstream historical fact, the Tower of London was not just a place of imprisonment, but also a political tool used to instill fear and consolidate power. Henry VIII sent two of his own wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, here to be executed. They were not common criminals, they were queens. Their imprisonment and execution were a public and very deliberate display of the king's absolute authority. This was a place where a person's social standing meant nothing if they had fallen out of favour with the monarch. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that the tower had its own menagerie of exotic animals, lions, leopards, and even a polar bear were kept here as a way to show off the wealth and power of the English monarchy? Imagine a polar bear, on a long chain, fishing for its dinner in the Thames. It's a surreal and slightly comical image, but it's a reminder that this was not just a place of darkness and death, it was also a symbol of royal power in a very strange way. Historians still argue whether the tower's reputation for torture was exaggerated or if the grim stories were a true reflection of the brutality that took place within its walls. You can see the dark, narrow windows and the heavy iron doors, and you feel the chills run down your spine. The stories of torture devices like the rack and the thumbscrews were used as a psychological weapon, a way to make people confess to crimes they may or may not have committed. It was not just a prison, it was an instrument of state control. You walk past the stone walls and you can almost hear the echoes of the people who were brought here. A nobleman who had displeased the king, a priest who refused to accept the new religion, a commoner who had dared to speak out against the crown. The tower was a silent witness to all of their stories, and it was a final, chilling destination for many of them. You feel a profound sense of relief that you can simply walk away, that your life isn't in the hands of a king who could decide your fate on a whim. Having been thoroughly intimidated by the Tower of London, you now turn your thoughts to something a little less life-threatening, but still incredibly restrictive: Tudor fashion. You've seen the elaborate clothes of the wealthy and the simple tunics of the peasants, but you haven't yet considered what it must have felt like to wear them. This wasn't about comfort or practicality, it was about status, conformity, and a kind of elegant torture. A mainstream historical fact, Tudor clothing was an incredibly complex and rigid system of layers. Men of the upper class wore doublets, which were tight-fitting jackets, and hose, which were essentially stockings. Women wore corsets that were so restrictive they could literally rearrange their internal organs, and huge, structured skirts called farthingales. All of this was topped off with a stiff, starched linen ruff around the neck. The clothes were made from heavy fabrics like velvet and silk, and they were often embroidered with gold and silver thread. You can almost feel the weight of a nobleman's doublet, the sheer bulk of it, and the lack of any real freedom of movement. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that the massive, stiff ruffs that were so popular in the late Tudor period were a huge fire hazard? They were made from starched linen, which was highly flammable, and they were often so large that people had to be careful not to lean too close to a fireplace. You can imagine a courtier trying to warm himself by a fire, suddenly realizing that his entire collar is about to go up in flames. It's a very strange and slightly comical example of a fashion trend that was literally dangerous. Historians still argue whether the extreme discomfort of Tudor fashion was a deliberate choice to show off wealth and leisure, or if it was simply a style that evolved from the available materials and social norms. You can see how a nobleman's restrictive clothes would serve as a powerful signal that he didn't have to do any manual labor. His clothes were a sign that he was literally too stiff to work, but you also see the immense discomfort in the way people walk and sit, and you can't help but think that a modern pair of sweatpants would be a revolution. You feel a phantom itch on your neck, thinking about those starched ruffs. They were so stiff that people had to use special tools to put them on, and they would chafe your neck raw. And as for hygiene, well, remember what we said about that? These clothes were not easy to wash, and they were worn for long periods of time, making them a veritable hothouse for body odor and skin ailments. You feel a pang of homesickness for the simple, comfortable clothes that you take for granted every day. Having been sufficiently constricted by the thought of Tudor fashion, you turn your attention to the people who wore them, specifically, the children. You pass by a small yard where a group of children are playing a simple game with a wooden hoop. They look like children everywhere, but you notice a few things that are deeply unsettling. Their clothes are simple and worn, and some of them look thin and unwell. This, you realize, is a world where childhood was a brief and dangerous journey, and a shocking number of them would not live to see adulthood. A mainstream historical fact: infant and child mortality rates were incredibly high in Tudor England. It's estimated that roughly a third of all children died before they reached the age of 5. This was due to a combination of factors: poor nutrition, a lack of medical knowledge, unsanitary conditions, and the ever-present threat of disease. For a Tudor family, having a large number of children was not a sign of a large family. It was a way of hedging their bets against the high probability of losing some of them. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that many children were swaddled so tightly that they could barely move? The belief was that this would help their limbs grow straight and strong. It was also a way to keep them from rolling into the fire or falling out of bed. It's a sad image: a baby wrapped up like a tiny mummy, unable to move or stretch. And it's a reminder that parental love in this era was expressed in ways that we would find both strange and a little cruel. Historians still argue whether the high death rates led to a kind of emotional detachment from children, where parents were afraid to get too attached. You can see how this would happen. When a child's life was so fragile, it might be an emotional defense mechanism to not get too close. But you also see the love in the way a mother holds her baby or a father teaches his son a skill. It's a complex and heartbreaking reality. A world where love and loss were constant companions. You watch as a little girl stumbles and scrapes her knee on a cobblestone. She cries, and her mother comes to her, wiping the wound with a dirty cloth. You wince, knowing the risk of infection. A simple fall that we would barely notice was a potential life-threatening event. The children's games looked the same, but the stakes were so much higher. They were not just playing, they were surviving. You've seen the fragility of life and the immense power of the monarch, and you're about to see how those two things intersect in a very public and brutal way. You find yourself in a bustling public square, but the atmosphere isn't one of celebration. A crowd has gathered, all hushed and waiting. In the center of the square is a scaffold, a pillory, and other implements of punishment. This is the Tudor version of a spectacle, a public event designed to entertain, to warn, and to instill fear. This is the brutality of public punishment. A mainstream historical fact: public executions and punishments were a common and accepted part of life in Tudor England. People were executed for a wide range of crimes, from murder to treason to petty theft. The hangings, beheadings, and burnings were not hidden away. They were performed in public squares for all to see. The idea was to create a powerful deterrent, to make the consequences of crime so visible and so terrifying that no one would dare to commit them. You can almost feel the collective shiver of the crowd, a mix of morbid curiosity and genuine fear. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that during this period, a common punishment for a woman who was considered a gossip or a scold was to be placed in a ducking stool? She would be strapped into a chair and repeatedly dunked into a river or a pond. It was a humiliating and public ritual designed to tame an unruly woman. It's a very strange and almost comical example of the bizarre punishments they would invent to control people's behavior. Historians still argue whether these public punishments were effective at deterring crime or if they simply desensitized people to violence. You can see both sides. The fear of public humiliation and pain was a powerful motivator, but you also see how the crowd, after the initial shock, begins to view it as a form of entertainment. You see a vendor selling roasted nuts and a child pointing and laughing at a man in the stocks. It's a grim and unsettling mix of cruelty and everyday life. You feel a profound sense of unease. You're witnessing something that seems barbaric and alien to your modern sensibilities. You realize that justice in this era was not a matter of rehabilitation, it was a matter of retribution. There was no discussion of mental health or social causes of crime. There was just the crime and the punishment. The sheer finality of it all is chilling. You watch as a man is led to the scaffold, his face pale with fear, and you realize that his story is about to come to a very public and very painful end. The chilling spectacle of public punishment has left you with a profound sense of how precarious life was. It also makes you wonder what else people clung to for a sense of order and meaning. You walk into a small parish church, and the air is thick with the smell of incense and beeswax. People are kneeling, praying, and lighting candles. This, you realize, is the other side of the Tudor coin, the profound and all-encompassing power of the church and superstition. A mainstream historical fact: the church was the single most powerful institution in Tudor England. second only to the monarchy. It governed not just people's spiritual lives, but their social, political, and economic lives as well. It was the source of all morality and all knowledge. The church dictated everything from how you were born to how you were buried. It was the center of village life, and people attended Mass every single day. The priest was a powerful figure in the community, and his word was often as good as law. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that the Tudors had a deep-seated belief in magic and good luck charms? People would wear amulets to ward off evil spirits, and they would consult with cunning folk, or local wise women, who were believed to have special knowledge of herbs and spells. You can almost imagine a worried mother trying to protect her sick child with a charm made from a badger's tooth. It's a blend of Christian faith and pagan superstition that seems very strange to our modern eyes. Historians still argue whether the common folk's faith was a matter of genuine piety, or if it was simply a form of social conformity. You can see both sides. The church was an inescapable part of life, and the fear of hell was a powerful motivator. But you also see the genuine comfort that people find in their faith, and you see the sincere hope in their eyes as they kneel to pray. For a person in this era, faith was not just a belief, it was a constant, tangible presence that gave them a sense of control in a world that was utterly unpredictable. You can feel the quiet solemnity in the church, a place of peace in a very chaotic world. You see a woman drop a small coin into a box for the poor, and you realize that the church was also the only form of social safety net that existed. It was the one institution that was supposed to care for the sick, the poor, and the widowed. You have a profound appreciation for the simple, but powerful, comfort that faith must have provided in this era. In a world with no medicine, no reliable food supply, and no justice, the promise of a better afterlife must have been a very sweet and powerful solace. The comfort of the church and the comfort of superstition are two sides of the same coin, and you're about to see how quickly one can become the other. You've heard whispers of the cunning folk, but now you feel the collective fear of the unknown that permeated Tudor life, the fear of things that go bump in the night, the fear of things that can't be explained by science or faith. This is the fear of witchcraft. A mainstream historical fact, the fear of witchcraft was a widespread and genuine terror in Tudor England. People believed that witches were real, that they could cast spells, curse crops, and cause sickness. The fear was so profound that it was written into law. The Witchcraft Act of 1542, enacted by Henry VIII, made witchcraft a felony punishable by death. You can almost feel the paranoia in the air, the way people glance nervously at their neighbours, wondering if a sudden illness or a crop failure was just bad luck or something far more sinister. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that many people believed that if a witch had put a curse on you, the only way to break it was to burn or boil a lock of the witch's hair or a piece of her clothing? You can imagine the bizarre scene of a worried family, huddled around a cauldron, boiling a bit of cloth, hoping it would reverse a spell. It's a very strange and desperate form of magical thinking. Historians still argue whether the witch hunts were a result of genuine fear, or if they were a way for communities to scapegoat unpopular or unconventional people, especially women. You can see how this would happen. If a woman was a little too old, a little too outspoken, or a little too good at herbal medicine, she could easily become the target of suspicion. The accusation of witchcraft was a powerful weapon, and it was used to silence and control people who didn't fit in. You feel a pang of sympathy for the woman who, for a simple act of charity or a bit of strange behaviour, might find herself at the end of a very angry mob. You see a group of children pointing at an old woman with a cane, their faces a mixture of fear and excitement. You hear one of them whisper, "She's a witch," and you realise that this isn't just a story, it's a very real and very dangerous reality. The fear of witchcraft was a powerful and constant threat, a dark shadow that hung over every village and every town. The deep-seated fear of witchcraft you've just felt is a powerful example of the religious turmoil in Tudor England. And you're now going to see that turmoil on a grand, national scale. The air feels different here, more charged, more tense. You're in a place of great change, where a new religion is being born, and the old one is being violently cast aside. This is the heart of the English Reformation, a seismic shift that reshaped the entire country. A mainstream historical fact, the English Reformation began with King Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church in 1534. It was sparked by his desire for an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, but it quickly became a full-blown religious and political revolution. the king declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, seized the land and wealth of the monasteries, and ordered the Bible to be translated into English. This was not a slow, gentle transition. It was a violent and often chaotic upheaval. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that during this time, a number of religious relics were publicly destroyed? The most famous example is the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral, which was one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in all of Europe. Henry VIII ordered it to be dismantled and all its gold, jewels, and other treasures to be confiscated. The saint was even posthumously put on trial for treason. It's a very strange and almost petty example of a king's willingness to go to any length to assert his power. Historians still argue whether the English people were ready for a new religion or if it was simply imposed on them from the top down. You can see both sides. There were certainly people who were frustrated with the corruption and power of the Catholic Church. But you also see the fear and confusion in the faces of the common folk, who were told that the faith they had held for centuries was now wrong. The speed of the change was dizzying. One day, you were praying to saints, and a week later, you were told that such things were considered idolatry. You feel a pang of sympathy for the people who were caught in the middle, torn between their old beliefs and the new laws of the land. You walk past a small church and you see a group of men pulling down a stained glass window that depicts a saint. You hear a woman in the crowd whisper that her grandmother used to pray to that very saint for a good harvest. And you realize that this is not just a matter of theology, it's a matter of tradition, of memory, and of community. The English Reformation was not just a political act, it was a deeply personal one for every single person in the country. The religious chaos of the Reformation has left you feeling a bit disoriented. You've seen the grand, national shifts. But now you're back in London, in the thick of it all. As you walk down Cheapside, the main market street, you feel a new sense of the city's character. This is a sensory overload, a journey through Tudor London that is a world away from the picturesque scenes in paintings. A mainstream historical fact: Tudor London was a densely packed but bustling metropolis with a population that was growing at an unsustainable rate. The streets were narrow and winding, with the upper floors of the houses often jutting out so far that they nearly touched the buildings opposite, creating a sort of permanent gloom below. The city was a mix of the incredibly wealthy and the desperately poor, all living and working in close proximity. This was a city that was alive, loud, and constantly on the move. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that the puddle, a common feature of London's streets, wasn't just rainwater? It was a mix of mud, human and animal waste, and refuse from all the shops and homes. It was so common that people had to wear special clogs or pattens to keep their feet out of the filth. It's a very strange thought, that the way you get around a city is by wearing shoes on top of your shoes. Historians still argue whether the extreme crowding and lack of sanitation were a cause of the city's frequent fires, or if the use of wood and thatch in building was the main culprit. You can see how a single spark could quickly become an inferno. The houses were packed so close together, and the air was so full of soot and smoke, that it feels like a disaster waiting to happen. You hear the cry of a vendor, the clatter of a horse-drawn cart, and the low hum of thousands of conversations all at once. You are pushed and shoved by the crowd, and you can't help but notice the variety of people around you. You see a wealthy merchant in a silk doublet, a foreign sailor with a strange accent, and a beggar with a wooden bowl. This is a city of all walks of life, and it's a melting pot of different cultures and ideas, but you also feel a deep sense of unease. You're never really alone here. You can't escape the noise, the smells, or the constant press of humanity. It's a powerful reminder that privacy and personal space were concepts that simply did not exist. The constant chaos of London and its ever-present dangers have you thinking about the greatest of them all. You find yourself walking past a large, empty field, but the local people give it a wide berth. This is a place with a grim and terrifying history, a place where a past epidemic wiped out entire families. You feel the lingering shadow of the Black Death, an event that may have happened a century and a half before the Tudors, but whose terror still hung over every single person. A mainstream historical fact: the Black Death, a bubonic plague pandemic that swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killed an estimated 30 to 60% of the European population. It had a profound and lasting impact on the collective psyche of the English people. For the Tudors, the plague wasn't an ancient memory, it was a recurring nightmare: outbreaks, though smaller, still happened regularly, and the mere mention of the word was enough to cause panic. They lived with the constant, low-grade fear that the great pestilence could return at any moment. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that during plague outbreaks, people would sometimes carry a hollowed-out orange or apple filled with vinegar and spices to their nose? They believed that the strong scent would ward off the disease. It's a sad and slightly humorous image. People walking around with fruit to their faces, desperately trying to outsmart a microscopic killer they couldn't possibly understand. Historians still argue whether the memory of the Black Death led to a sort of cultural fatalism, where people simply accepted that death was a constant companion, or if it made them more determined to live life to the fullest. You can see both sides. The constant threat of death could lead to a kind of carpe diem attitude, where you lived for the moment, but it also led to a deep-seated anxiety and a feeling of powerlessness. You see a man praying in front of a small cross, and you realize that his prayer isn't for a good harvest or a long life. It's a simple, humble prayer for another day. You feel a sense of profound vulnerability. In our modern world, we see epidemics as a terrible but contained event. For the Tudors, it was just a part of the air they breathed. Every cough, every fever, every rash was a potential sign of the end. The Black Death was the ultimate boogeyman, and it was always lurking just around the corner. The fear of disease, you've realized, was a constant companion. But what about the things people had more control over? You find yourself in front of the local magistrate's court, a small, somber building with a heavy wooden door. This is a place where you get to see how the Tudors handled crime and justice, and you realize that this, too, was a brutal and often arbitrary affair. There was no concept of innocent until proven guilty, and the legal system was swift, and often very, very final. A mainstream historical fact, Tudor law was incredibly harsh. Even for minor offences, a person could be executed for a wide range of crimes, from treason to theft of a small amount of goods. There were no lawyers or juries in the modern sense. The accused had to defend themselves, often against a powerful lord or a wealthy landowner. The justice system was not about finding the truth, it was about protecting property and maintaining the social order. You can imagine the terror of being accused of a crime, knowing that your word was worth nothing against that of a rich and powerful man. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that during a trial, if a person was accused of a crime, they were often not allowed to speak? The court would simply present the evidence, and the accused would be expected to plead guilty or not guilty, and if they refused to plead, they could be subjected to a painful form of torture called peine forte et dure, where they would be slowly crushed by heavy stones until they either pleaded or died. It's a very strange and horrific example of how little value was placed on the rights of the accused. Historians still argue whether this brutal system of justice was a true reflection of the Tudor people's morality, or if it was a necessary tool to control a population with little education and few opportunities. You can see both sides. The system was clearly designed to protect the powerful, but it also created a powerful deterrent for crime. You see a man being led out of the courthouse in chains, and you realize that his life is about to take a very dark turn. There's no appeal, no second chance. The judgment of the court is final. You feel a profound sense of gratitude for our modern legal system, for the idea of a fair trial and the right to an attorney. In Tudor England, justice wasn't blind, it had a very clear and very painful vision, and its purpose was not to right a wrong, but to make an example. The sight of the court and the man in chains has you thinking about what awaited him. You are now standing in front of a Tudor prison. It's not a large, imposing building, but a small, cramped, and filthy place. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and despair. This isn't a place for rehabilitation, it's a place for punishment, and it's a living nightmare. A mainstream historical fact, Tudor prisons were not designed to be a place of punishment. They were simply a holding area for people awaiting trial or execution. But because the legal system was so slow, a person could be held in these squalid conditions for months or even years. There was no government funding for prisons. So the jailer made his money by charging the inmates for everything, a bed, a blanket, and even a bit of food. If you couldn't pay, you were left to rot in the filth. A wealthy man could live in relative comfort, while a poor man could die of starvation or disease. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that people who were in debtors' prisons would often have their wives or children stand outside the prison walls and beg for money? They would use a long pole with a net on the end to collect coins from passers-by. This was a common sight in London, and it's a very sad and poignant example of the desperation of the poor. Historians still argue whether the cruelty of the prison system was a deliberate act of class warfare, or if it was simply a result of a lack of a better solution. You can see both sides. The system clearly favoured the rich and punished the poor, but there were no government funds to make it better. The prison was a business, and the jailer was just a businessman. You hear a man coughing from within the prison walls, and you realise that he's not just sick, he's trapped in a world of filth, disease, and despair. And there's no way out. You feel a profound sense of relief that you can simply walk away. For the people inside, there's no escape. The prison is a final, suffocating stop on their journey, a place where hope goes to die, leaving the grim reality of the prison behind. You find yourself on a dirt road, looking out at the open countryside. You've seen London and a village, but what about the journey between them? You realise that travel in Tudor England was not a simple or a safe affair. It was a long, arduous, and often perilous journey that could take days or even weeks. A mainstream historical fact: Tudor roads were little more than muddy tracks, often filled with ruts and potholes. There were no paved roads, no signposts, and no reliable maps. Travelling was incredibly slow, and it was a constant battle against the elements. If it rained, the roads became a quagmire of mud and filth. If you were lucky, you could travel by horse. But a simple cart or a foot journey was far more common. A trip that would take you an hour today could take you 2 or 3 days back then. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that many travellers would have to carry their own food and drink? There were a few inns along the way, but they were often filled with other travellers, and the food was not always reliable. Many people would simply sleep in the open air, a very dangerous undertaking given the presence of thieves and vagrants. It's a very strange thought, a journey that was not about sightseeing, but about simple, raw survival. Historians still argue whether the slow pace of travel was a cause of the regional differences in language and culture, or if it simply reinforced existing ones. You can see both sides. When a village was isolated, it developed its own unique customs and dialect. The only way to get to the next village was a long and dangerous journey, and you can see how that would lead to a very insular and isolated culture. The road was not a path to new experiences, it was a path to more of the same, with a side of danger. You feel the phantom ache in your legs and the dust in your hair. You have a profound sense of appreciation for the simple, but profound luxury of a smooth road and a fast car. For the Tudor traveller, the journey was a test of endurance, and its outcome was never guaranteed. You've seen the hardships of travel and the fragility of life. And now you're going to get a powerful reminder of how long those hardships could last. You are in the heart of the English countryside, but the landscape is scarred with the ghosts of a long, brutal civil war. The locals speak of it in hushed tones, as if it happened only yesterday. This is the enduring legacy of the Wars of the Roses, a mainstream historical fact. The Wars of the Roses was a series of dynastic civil wars fought between the houses of Lancaster and York from 1455 to 1487. The conflict was a long and bloody struggle for the throne of England. It ended with the defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII, Henry VIII's father. But the peace was a fragile one, and the memory of the conflict was still very much alive in the Tudor period. You see the ruins of a castle that was a battlefield, and you can almost hear the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that the term Wars of the Roses wasn't actually used until the 19th century? The name was coined by a writer who was referring to the emblems of the two warring houses, the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. It's a bit like calling the American Civil War the War of the Blue and Grey. It's a powerful and poetic name, but it's a later invention. Historians still argue whether the Wars of the Roses were a purely political conflict or if they were also a matter of genuine social and economic upheaval. You can see how a long, drawn-out war would have had a profound impact on the common people. The constant fighting, The changing loyalties and the destruction of property would have made life incredibly difficult, and you can see how Henry VII's reign was a time of immense political consolidation, a way to make sure that such a bloody conflict would never happen again. The Tudors' power was a direct result of the chaos that came before them. You feel the weight of this history in the very air. The people you meet have a deep-seated suspicion of change and a profound loyalty to their local lord. You realize that for them, the recent past wasn't a matter of dates in a history book, it was a living memory, a powerful lesson in the fragility of peace and the brutality of ambition. The long, bloody shadow of the Wars of the Roses reminds you that Tudor life wasn't all work and no play. You're in a village green, and you see a group of men and boys engaged in a game of football. But this isn't the civilized game you know. The ball is a lump of wood, and the rules seem to be a bit fluid. This, you realize, is a glimpse into the dangerous world of Tudor leisure. A mainstream historical fact, Tudor leisure activities were often incredibly violent and brutal by modern standards. Football, for example, was a wild and chaotic game with hundreds of players and no real rules. The goal was to get a ball to a designated landmark, and a person could be seriously injured or even killed in the process. The game was so violent that it was often banned by royal proclamation. Another popular pastime was bear baiting, where a bear was chained to a post and dogs were set upon it. It was a popular form of entertainment for both the commoners and the royalty. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that the Tudors were also very fond of a sport called tilting? It was a kind of jousting tournament where two knights would ride at each other with lances. It was incredibly dangerous, and knights were often seriously injured or killed. The most famous example is King Henry VIII himself, who was a skilled tilter but was also seriously injured in an accident that some historians believe led to his health problems later in life. Historians still argue whether the violence of these pastimes was a reflection of the brutality of Tudor society or if it was simply a release from the hardships of everyday life. You can see both sides. The games were a way for people to let off steam and to show off their physical prowess. But they were also a reflection of a culture that was not squeamish about violence and pain. You see a man get kicked in the shin during a game of football, and he just laughs it off. You realize that their pain tolerance and their idea of what was fun were very different from our own. You feel a profound sense of relief that your own leisure activities don't involve a high risk of being trampled or gored by a bear. The Tudor people's idea of a good time was a bit too close to a medical emergency for your comfort. You've seen the long, bloody shadow of Henry VIII's reign, but now, as you walk through the streets, you feel a new sense of purpose and stability in the air. The mood is different, the fear is still there, but it's tempered with a kind of cautious optimism. This, you realize, is the Elizabethan era's rise. This is the transition from a time of fear and uncertainty to a time of relative peace and stability, a mainstream historical fact. After the tumultuous reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary Worcester, Elizabeth I brought a period of peace and prosperity to England. Her reign, which lasted from 1558 to 1603, was a time of great cultural and economic growth. She was a shrewd and intelligent ruler who was able to navigate the religious and political turmoil of her time with a deft hand. She was loved by her people, and she was a powerful symbol of England's growing strength on the world stage. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that Queen Elizabeth I was a master of political theatre? She would use her clothes, her jewellery, and her public appearances to project an image of power and stability. She famously wore a large, white ruff and a red wig, which became her signature look. She was a master of using her image to control her narrative, and she was very, very good at it. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's reign was a time of genuine progress or if it was simply a period of relative calm before another storm. You can see both sides. She was a powerful and effective ruler, but she was also a product of her time. She was still a monarch with absolute power, and the punishments for treason and sedition were still incredibly harsh. But you also see the genuine love and admiration that her people had for her. You hear a person speaking of her with reverence, calling her Good Queen Bess, and you realize that for them, she was a powerful and comforting symbol of stability in a world that was still very, very dangerous. The new sense of optimism under Elizabeth I has a very real and very powerful source of fear, and you feel it in the air as you stand at a coastal town. You can almost smell the salt in the air and the tension on the faces of the people. This is the spectre of the Spanish Armada, a military threat so large and so real that it would define Elizabeth's reign and secure England's place on the world stage. A mainstream historical fact: in 1588, King Philip II of Spain, a staunch Catholic and a former husband of Elizabeth's half-sister Mary Stuart, launched a massive fleet of 130 ships with the intention of invading England. The Spanish Armada was considered the most powerful navy in the world, and its goal was to overthrow Elizabeth and restore Catholicism. It was an existential threat to England's very existence, and the entire country mobilized to fight it. You can almost hear the roar of the cannons and the terrified cries of the people. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that the English Navy, under the command of Sir Francis Drake, used fire ships to break up the Spanish fleet? They filled old, disused ships with flammable materials, set them on fire, and sent them sailing into the heart of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish ships, anchored close together, panicked and scattered, making them easy targets for the smaller, more nimble English ships. It was a brilliant and very effective naval tactic. Historians still argue whether the English victory was a result of superior naval tactics, or if it was simply a matter of luck and the rough weather that scattered the Spanish fleet. You can see both sides. The English ships were faster and more agile, but the storm that hit the Armada as it tried to sail around the coast of Scotland was a powerful and unexpected ally. You see a man on the beach, staring out at the sea, and you realize that he's not just a person in a history book. He's a man who has lived through a moment of national terror and a moment of immense national pride. You feel a sense of unity and purpose in the air. The English people, divided by class and religion, were united by a single, powerful threat. The defeat of the Spanish Armada wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological one. It cemented Elizabeth's place as a powerful and beloved monarch, and it created a sense of national identity and destiny that would last for centuries. The defeat of the Spanish Armada solidified England's place as a powerful naval force, and that power turned outward, toward the vast, unknown oceans. You are now in a busy port. The air is thick with the smell of tar and salt, and the docks are filled with ships ready for a long journey. This is the age of Tudor explorers and new worlds, and it was a time of incredible risk, immense reward, and a lot of suffering. A mainstream historical fact: the Tudor period was a time of great exploration. English sailors like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh set out to find new trade routes, new lands, and new sources of wealth for the crown. These journeys were incredibly dangerous, and many ships and men were lost to storms, starvation, and disease. But the potential rewards were immense: new spices, new goods, and new land to claim for the Queen. It was a race for power, wealth, and national pride. And England was now a major player. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that a common remedy for scurvy on these long voyages was a kind of herbal mixture? But most sailors didn't know that the real cure was fresh fruit and vegetables. So many of them died of the disease, even when they had access to citrus fruits that could have saved them. It's a sad and frustrating example of how a lack of scientific knowledge could have such a devastating human cost. Historians still argue whether the Tudor explorers were brave adventurers or if they were simply pirates and opportunists. You can see both sides. Men like Drake were a powerful symbol of English strength, but they also engaged in piracy and slave trading. Their motivations were a complex mix of patriotism, greed, and a thirst for adventure. You see a young man, his eyes full of hope and excitement, signing onto a ship, and you wonder if he knows the true dangers that await him. He's not just a sailor, he's a pioneer, a risk-taker, and a product of a culture that was no longer afraid of the sea. You feel the vastness of the ocean and the profound sense of possibility that it held. For the first time, the English people were looking beyond their own small island and toward a new and exciting world. From the vastness of the ocean, you now find yourself in the small, crowded, and smoky interior of a Tudor tavern. The air is thick with the smell of spilled ale, wood smoke, and a lot of unwashed people. The noise is incredible: the sound of laughter, shouted conversations, and a lute player in the corner. This, you realize, is the world of the Tudor tavern. And it was a hub of social life. A mainstream historical fact: taverns were more than just a place to get a drink. They were a central part of community life, a place where people from all walks of life could come together. They were used for everything from business meetings to social gatherings. People would come to hear the latest news and gossip, and they were often a place where political and religious debates would take place. The tavern was a kind of informal social club, and its importance to the community cannot be overstated. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that in many taverns, the innkeeper would keep a chalk mark on a blackboard behind the bar to keep a running tally of a person's bill? The phrase "chalk it up" comes from this practice. It's a small but charming example of how life was simpler and more communal in some ways. Historians still argue whether the tavern was a place of dangerous debauchery, or if it was simply a place of community and conversation. You can see both sides. There was certainly a lot of drinking and gambling, and the occasional brawl, but it was also a place where a poor man could feel like he was a part of something, where he could forget his troubles for a little while and enjoy the company of others. You see a group of men huddled around a table, and you hear their laughter, and you realize that this is a place of genuine camaraderie and joy. From the loud and lively atmosphere of the tavern, you now find yourself in a much quieter, but no less vibrant, space, a theatre. The building is a wooden structure with an open-air yard, and the stage is a simple wooden platform. This is the world of the Tudor stage, and it was a form of entertainment that was enjoyed by all classes, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble. This is where you see the genius of a man named William Shakespeare, a mainstream historical fact. The Tudor period was the golden age of English theatre. Playwrights like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe were creating some of the most enduring works in the English language. The plays were performed for a wide audience, and they were a mix of comedy, tragedy, and history. The theatre was a place where a common person could see a story about a king or a queen, and a noble could laugh at a play about a commoner. It was a powerful tool for social commentary and a reflection of the human condition. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that all the parts in a Tudor play, even the female roles, were played by men or boys? It was considered unseemly for women to be on the stage. The boys who played the female roles were often apprenticed to the theatre and trained from a young age. It's a very strange and slightly comical thought, a world where the most famous female characters in literature were all played by teenage boys. Historians still argue whether the plays were a reflection of the general public's ideas and morals or if they were simply a form of entertainment. You can see both sides. The plays were certainly designed to entertain, but they also explored complex ideas about love, power, and loyalty. Shakespeare's plays, in particular, were a mirror of the society in which he lived, and they gave the common people a chance to see their own lives and struggles reflected on the stage. You hear the laughter and the tears of the audience, and you realize that these plays are not just a historical artifact, they are a living, the breathing part of the human experience. From the world of entertainment, you now turn your attention to the world of daily life. You're standing in front of a Tudor house, and you notice something strange. The windows are small, and there are very few of them. The walls are made of a mix of wood and plaster, and the roof is thatched. This is a typical Tudor house, and it's full of hidden secrets and surprising realities. A mainstream historical fact: Tudor houses, even for the wealthy, were not designed with modern comforts in mind. The windows were small because glass was incredibly expensive. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a mix of woven sticks and mud, and the roofs were thatched, which was a fire hazard. The houses were also very dark, and they were often drafty and cold. The average Tudor person would have had no concept of a well-lit, centrally heated home. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that the Tudors had a very strange custom of hanging a piece of meat from the ceiling? They would use it as a kind of air freshener. The meat would absorb the moisture and the smells from the house, and it would be a kind of primitive way to keep the house from smelling so bad. It's a very strange and slightly disgusting example of how they dealt with a very real problem. Historians still argue whether the lack of comfort in Tudor houses was a matter of a lack of technology or if it was simply a matter of a different set of priorities. You can see both sides. The houses were certainly not comfortable by our standards, but they were also a reflection of a society that valued community and shared space. A family would often live and work in the same room, and there was very little in the way of privacy. You can almost feel the cold seeping through the walls, and you have a profound appreciation for the simple but powerful luxury of a well-insulated home. From the dark and drafty interiors of the Tudor house, you now turn your attention to the animals that shared the space. You're in a small barn, and the air is thick with the smell of hay and manure. You see a cow, a few chickens, and a pig, all living in close proximity. This, you realize, is a world where animals were not just a part of life, They were essential for survival, and they were also a source of constant danger. A mainstream historical fact, animals were a vital part of the Tudor economy and a source of food, labour, and companionship. A peasant's life would have revolved around his livestock. A cow provided milk and meat, a pig provided bacon and lard, and a chicken provided eggs. But these animals were also a source of disease, and they often carried parasites and other illnesses that could be passed on to humans. There was no concept of a hygienic or clean animal farm. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that a common part of a Tudor diet was something called black pudding? It was a sausage made from pig's blood, oatmeal, and spices. It's a rather gruesome but very practical example of how they used every part of the animal to ensure nothing went to waste. Historians still argue whether the close proximity of humans and animals led to a higher rate of disease or if it was simply a matter of a lack of knowledge. You can see how the lack of sanitation and the close proximity of humans and animals would have been a perfect breeding ground for disease. You hear a pig squeal, and you realize that its life and your life are a part of a very messy and very intertwined ecosystem. Leaving the farm animals behind, you now step into a world that is a different kind of wild. You're in the Tudor countryside, and you realize that this is not the pastoral, peaceful landscape you might have imagined. It's a world of unkempt forests, dangerous roads, and a constant, low-grade fear of the unknown. The dangers of the Tudor countryside were a very real part of life, a mainstream historical fact. The countryside was a dangerous place, even for a short journey. There were no streetlights, no signposts, and no reliable maps. The forests were often filled with wild animals, and the roads were filled with highwaymen and vagrants. A person travelling alone would have been a very tempting target, and many people would travel in large groups or with armed guards. The idea of a quiet, peaceful walk in the woods was a luxury that simply did not exist. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that people would sometimes leave a small piece of bread or a coin at a crossroads as a way of asking for safe passage? It was a kind of primitive way of asking for a blessing from a local spirit or saint. It's a very sweet and slightly superstitious example of how they dealt with the fear of the unknown. Historians still argue whether the high rate of crime in the countryside was a result of poverty, or if it was simply a natural consequence of a world with no police force. You can see how a person with no job and no home would be tempted to turn to a life of crime. You feel the rustle of the leaves and the snap of a twig, and you can't help but look over your shoulder. You have a profound appreciation for the simple, but powerful, luxury of a safe and well-lit road. Having survived the dangers of the countryside, you find yourself at a magnificent Tudor manor house. The grounds are expansive and manicured, and the house itself is a beautiful, sprawling building. You see a group of people working in the gardens, their heads bowed, their movements quiet and deliberate. This, you realize, is the life of a Tudor servant, and it was a life of endless labour, little pay, and a constant subservience to their masters. A mainstream historical fact, a household in Tudor England was a bustling hub of activity, with a large number of servants working to keep it running. Servants were not just maids and butlers, they were cooks, stable hands, gardeners, and laundresses. Their lives were a relentless cycle of hard work, from dawn until dusk, and their wages were often very low. They had no holidays, no sick days, and they were at the mercy of their master's whims. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that a high-ranking servant, like a chambermaid or a butler, would be given a special livery or uniform? It was a sign of their loyalty to the family and a symbol of their high status. It's a very strange thought. A uniform that was a mark of both servitude and prestige. Historians still argue whether the relationship between a master and a servant was one of genuine affection and loyalty, or if it was simply a matter of economic necessity. You can see both sides. There were certainly stories of masters who treated their servants like family, but there were also stories of cruelty and abuse. A servant's life was a very precarious one, and they could be fired for a single mistake. You see a young servant girl carrying a heavy basket of laundry, and you realize that her life is a constant, uphill battle. She has no privacy, no real freedom, and her entire existence is in the service of others. The immense wealth of the Tudor manor house you've just seen was a result of a massive and violent act of political and religious upheaval. You now stand in front of the silent, skeletal remains of a once great abbey. The walls are crumbling, the roof is gone, and the windows are just empty holes. This, you realize, is the devastating consequence of the dissolution of the monasteries, a mainstream historical fact in the 1530s. King Henry VIII, as the new head of the Church of England, ordered the dissolution of all monasteries, priories, and abbeys. He seized their land, their wealth, and their treasures, which were then sold off to the nobility and the gentry. It was a move that made the crown incredibly wealthy and secured the loyalty of the new landowners. It was also a move that left thousands of monks, nuns, and friars homeless and destitute. It was a massive and violent act of social and economic upheaval. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that the monks and nuns were often given a small pension after the dissolution? But it was so little that many of them were forced to beg on the streets. It's a very sad and poignant example of how a king's political decision had a very real and very devastating human cost. Historians still argue whether the dissolution was a necessary part of the Reformation or if it was simply an act of state-sponsored plunder. You can see both sides. The monasteries were incredibly wealthy and had a lot of political power, and a case could be made that they were corrupt, but they were also the only form of social safety net that existed. They cared for the sick, the poor, and the elderly. And when they were gone, there was nothing to take their place. You feel a deep sense of sadness as you look at the ruins. The air is still, but you can almost hear the ghosts of the people who once lived and worked here, their lives upended by a king's political ambition. The dissolution of the monasteries has given you a powerful glimpse into how little power the common people had, and that's especially true for women. You are now standing in a small cottage, watching a woman go about her daily chores. She is tending to the fire, mending a tunic, and keeping an eye on her children. She is a woman of immense strength and skill, but you realize that she has very little in the way of rights or opportunities. This is the role of women in Tudor society, a mainstream historical fact. Women in Tudor England had a very limited role in society. They were expected to be wives and mothers, and their lives were centered on the home. They were not allowed to own property, to hold a political office, or to run a business without their husband's permission. A woman's entire identity was tied to her father or her husband, and she was considered to be a legal dependent. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that in some cases, a woman could be a scrivener or a limner, a kind of artist, but only if she worked alongside her husband? It was one of the few ways a woman could use her skills to earn a living. Historians still argue whether a woman's lack of legal rights meant that she had no real power, or if she had a lot of power behind the scenes. You can see how a woman who was a good manager of a household or a skilled weaver could have a lot of influence on her family and her community, but you also see the immense limitations on her life. She was a person of immense value, but she was a person with very few rights. The immense burdens placed on Tudor women become even more apparent when you consider one of the most dangerous moments in their lives: childbirth. You are now in a small, cramped room, and you hear the sounds of a woman in labour. The air is thick with tension, and the faces of the women attending her are grim and worried. This, you realise, is a moment of immense peril, a life or death situation that was a constant part of life for every single woman in the country. A mainstream historical fact: childbirth was the leading cause of death for women in Tudor England. It was a process with a high risk of complications, including infection, hemorrhage, and a difficult delivery. There were no trained doctors or midwives. The woman was attended by her female friends and family, and the only help she had was their experience and a few herbs and prayers. It was a very dark and painful reality for every single woman in the country. A quirky or fringe tidbit: did you know that during a difficult delivery, a woman's bed would often be covered with a special sheet that was embroidered with symbols of saints? It was believed that the saints would help the woman and her baby get through the delivery safely. It's a very strange and desperate example of how people would turn to superstition when they had no medical knowledge. Historians still argue whether the high death rate in childbirth was a result of a lack of medical knowledge, or if it was simply a result of a woman's poor health and nutrition. You can see both sides. The lack of sanitation and the poor diet certainly made childbirth more dangerous, but you also see the immense powerlessness of the women who were in labour, with no real medical help and no hope of a better solution. The sheer finality of it all is chilling. You hear a baby's first cry, and you feel a profound sense of relief and gratitude. You know that another life has just been given a chance in a world that is not kind to its newest inhabitants. The fragility of life, you've realised, begins at birth, and it doesn't get much easier from there. You are now watching a group of children playing in a muddy street. They look happy, but they are also covered in dirt. Their clothes are torn. And you see a little girl with a bad cough. This, you realize, is the harsh reality of Tudor childhood, a time that was a far cry from the carefree innocence we associate with it today. A mainstream historical fact, a Tudor child's life was a brutal and often short one. Many children didn't live to see adulthood, but those who did were expected to work from a very young age. There was no concept of a childhood as we know it. A boy would be sent to an apprenticeship at the age of 7 or 8, and a girl would be expected to help with the household chores from a very young age. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that many children were sent to live with other families as servants or apprentices? It was a common practice, and it was a way for a family to lighten their financial burden and to give their child a chance to learn a trade. It's a very strange and slightly heartbreaking thought. A child being sent away from their family to live with strangers at such a young age. Historians still argue whether this practice was a matter of economic necessity or if it was simply a cultural tradition. You can see how a poor family with a lot of children would have no choice but to send their children away. But you also see how it would have been an incredibly difficult thing for a family to do. The children you see are not just playing, they are preparing for a life of hard work and hardship. From the hardships of childhood, you now find yourself in a very different world, the world of the Tudor military. You are in a training ground, and the air is thick with the sounds of marching feet, shouted orders, and the clanging of steel. This, you realize, is the Tudor military and its brutality, a world of violence, discipline, and a constant threat of death. A mainstream historical fact, the Tudor military was not a standing army. It was made up of a mix of royal guards, mercenaries, and local militias. The soldiers were often poorly paid, and their lives were a mix of long periods of boredom and short bursts of extreme violence. They were often sent on campaigns to foreign lands, and their lives were often short and brutal. There was no concept of a modern army with its uniforms and its code of conduct. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that a common part of a soldier's diet was a hard, dry biscuit called a ship's biscuit? It was so hard that it was often infested with weevils, and the soldiers would have to pound it with a hammer before they could eat it. It's a very strange and slightly disgusting example of the hardship that they faced. Historians still argue whether the Tudor military was a brutal but necessary part of the state, or if it was a reflection of the general violence of the era. You can see both sides. The military was certainly a brutal tool of state power, but it was also a way for a poor man to escape a life of poverty and to see the world. You hear a soldier's laugh, and you realize that he's not just a killing machine, he's a human being who is trying to find a bit of humor in a very dark and violent world. You've seen the brutality and the hardship of the Tudor world, and now you're going to get a chance to reflect on it all. You are in a modern museum, looking at a diorama of a Tudor street. The people are smiling, the colours are bright, and everything is clean and tidy. You have a new and very real sense of the distance between this sanitized image and the grim reality you've just experienced. This, you realize, is the lasting legacy of the Tudors. A mainstream historical fact, the Tudor period was a transformative time in English history. It was a time of immense change, from the religious revolution to the rise of England as a global power. The Tudors laid the foundation for the British Empire, and their legacy can still be seen in the laws, the language, and the institutions of modern Britain. The very idea of a strong, centralized state and a unified national identity was born during this period. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that the Tudors were the first English monarchs to use the title King of Ireland? It was a move that was meant to consolidate their power and to assert their dominance over the island. It was a political move that had a long and bloody consequence, and it's a very strange and dark part of their legacy. Historians still argue whether the Tudors were a period of progress or if they were simply a time of brutal and necessary consolidation. You can see both sides. The Tudors were certainly not a force for good in every way, but they were also a force for immense change. And they were the ones who brought England out of the Middle Ages and into the modern world. You feel a profound sense of gratitude for the simple luxuries that you have today, and you have a new and very real sense of the immense struggle that went into creating the world that we live in. The sanitized image of the Tudor world has left you with a new and very real sense of the distance between then and now. You are now in your own home, in your own bed, And you're surrounded by all the modern conveniences that you take for granted. You feel the soft sheets, the comfortable pillow, and the cool air from the air conditioner. This is a moment of profound gratitude and a powerful reminder of why we're glad we didn't live then. A mainstream historical fact: the average life expectancy in Tudor England was around 35 years. It was a world of constant hardship, disease, and violence. But in modern England, the life expectancy is around 81 years. We have access to clean water, reliable food, and incredible medical care. We have rights and freedoms that the Tudors could only have dreamed of. It is a world that is not perfect, but it is a world that is vastly better than the one you've just visited. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Did you know that a common fear for a Tudor was being buried alive? It was a very real fear, and people would often have their coffins equipped with a bell that they could ring if they woke up. It's a very strange and macabre example of the immense powerlessness that they felt in the face of death. Historians still argue whether our modern world is truly better, or if we have just traded one set of problems for another. You can see how a Tudor might argue that we are too soft, too disconnected from the real world, but you also feel a profound sense of relief that you don't have to worry about a plague doctor knocking on your door or a barber surgeon pulling your tooth. The journey is over. The ghosts of the Tudors have been put to rest. The sounds of the street, the stench of the River Fleet, and the fear of the Black Death are all just a memory. You are in your own bed, and the world is quiet. You feel the soft hum of the fan and the cool air on your face. This is the moment of goodbye to Tudor Britain, a final, calming descent into sleep. The hardships you've just experienced are not your own. The dangers were just a story, and the fear was just a feeling. You can let it all go. The brave faces of the peasants, the cold stone of the tower, the roar of the crowd at the execution, all of it is fading now. The history is a beautiful, dark, and complex tapestry, but it is not your reality. You can let the details go, the names of the kings and queens, the dates of the battles, the smell of the city. It's all slipping away. You are safe. You are warm. You are comfortable. The sun is setting on this long and difficult day, and a new, peaceful night is beginning. Let the thoughts drift away like clouds on a summer breeze. The story is over, and the past is where it belongs. Let yourself be carried away by the gentle hum of the fan and the slow, rhythmic beat of your own breath. End of script. Sweet dreams.